15.
Hello. In the summer of 2020, two sisters were called Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry were murdered in a park in Cricklewood, not far from where I live in North London. Their attacker told the police that he had intended to kill 6 women in 6 months. The next spring, Sarah Everard was abducted, raped and murdered by the policeman Wayne Cousins, and I started to wonder about why some men chose to kill women who were strangers to them, why they chose their victims, in effect, because they were women. And I looked for a story from the past that might help me to understand. I chose the murders at 10 Rillington Place in 1953, which were the most notorious crimes of their era. They took place very near here, less than half a mile due west, at a time when Notting Hill was an extremely deprived part of Britain. After years of war and austerity, the terraces were still damaged by bombs, rationing was still in force, crime was rife, housing was short. The streets were frequented by spivs, flashboys, prostitutes, black marketeers. There was also rising racial tension in the area since a number of West Indians had moved to Notting Hill after the British Nationality Act of 1948 gave them leave to work and live in this country. It was one of these black newcomers who discovered the crimes at 10 Rillington Place. He was a tenant of one of the upstairs rooms, and on the 24th of March 1953, he was clearing out the ground floor kitchen, which had been abandoned. He tore a hole in the wallpaper and saw behind it what looked like the bare flesh of a white woman. He called the police, who tore down the wall and found that in the alcove behind it, there were the bodies of 3 young women who had been recently murdered. When they searched the house, they found another body beneath the floorboards of the front room and the bones of 2 other women in the tiny back garden. One of their bones was even propping up the fence at the back of the yard. The police immediately launched a nationwide manhunt for the tenant of the ground floor flat of 10 Rillington Place, a man called John Reginald Halliday Christie, a middle-aged accounts clerk, who had gone on the run a few days before the bodies were discovered. He was captured on the banks of the Thames after a week, and he came easily with the police. He was polite, almost obsequious. He confessed to the crimes in a half-hearted way. "It must have been me," he said. He was an ordinary-looking fellow, balding, bespectacled. He usually wore a suit and tie, a Macintosh, a trilby. To his neighbours, he was the poshest, most respectable resident of Rillington Place. And he boasted to them and then to the police about his record as a soldier in the First World War and as a policeman in the Second. He expressed his high-minded morality. He disapproved of pubs, of prostitutes, of hard liquor, of immigrants. Pathologists at Scotland Yard had by now discovered that Christie had not only killed his victims, but he had gassed and raped them. The case was a huge sensation, which over the next few weeks vied for prominence in the pages of the national press with news of the preparations for the coronation of Elizabeth II at Westminster Abbey. The tabloid reporters competed fiercely for scoops and exclusives on his story. And when the case came to trial at the Old Bailey in June, 3 weeks after the Queen was crowned, there were crowds clamouring to get seats inside. Inside the courtroom, the case was watched by various luminaries, among them Cecil Beaton, society photographer, the actress Margaret Leighton, and the playwright Terence Rattigan. Christie's defence was insanity. He claimed to be unable to help himself and to have little memory of the murders. In the press, he was characterized as a kind of grotesque anomaly. He was described as a monster, a creature, a necrophile, a psychopath. But I was interested in what he had in common with the people of his place and time. In the press reports I saw echoes of his views, his hypocrisies, and his contempt for women. They were present also in the language used in court, even in the language used by the pathologists who performed the post-mortems on his victims. I was interested in the women who Christie had murdered, whose lives were covered very briefly in the news reports. They were dismissed on the whole as poor little tarts whose lives had been almost bound to end in violence. But when I looked in the Metropolitan Police files at the National Archives in Kew, I found many clues to their personalities and their histories scattered through the records. To take just one, the first woman he killed, Ruth First was a tall, striking, very thin young woman with big feet and dark curly hair, who was a Jewish refugee from Austria. She arrived in London in 1939. She wanted to be a nurse, and she secured a place at a training college. But when war broke out, she was classified as an enemy alien because of her nationality, and she had to leave her position as a student. She was subsequently sent to the Isle of Man, where she was interned in a camp for enemy aliens, and where she and the other Jewish women were bullied by the German and Austrian women sympathetic to the Nazis. On her release, she returned to London. She got a job in a munitions factory. She had an affair with a Cypriot waiter and gave birth to a baby, Sonia, in a home in West Hampstead. But she was forced to part with her baby at once because she didn't have the means to support her, and Sonia was taken into care in Tunbridge Wells in Kent, where Ruth visited her when she could. Ruth's family, in the meantime, had most of them escaped Austria and settled in New York, though her older brother had gone missing and is presumed to have died in a concentration camp. By 1943, Ruth was living in Notting Hill in a basement in Oxford Gardens, and she met Reg Christie in a cafe. We don't know how he tempted her home with him, but there are clues in the statements given to the press and the police by women who encountered Christie but who got away and lived to tell the tale. He would invite women back to his flat with promises of a bed for the night, or a glass of brandy, or a few pairs of nylon stockings, or some money in exchange for a nude photographic session, or an abortion. Nearly all the women that Christie killed were pregnant or rumoured to be pregnant at the time they died. And this brings us to a twist in the Christie case. 3 years before Christie was arrested, there was another double murder at 10 Rillington Place. The bodies of two of the residents of the top floor flat, a woman called Beryl Evans and her baby, Geraldine, were found strangled in the wash house in the backyard. Beryl's husband, Tim, handed himself into the police, saying that he had disposed of his wife after she had died accidentally during an abortion that Reg Christie was performing on her. Christie denied this, and Tim changed his story. He said, in fact, it was he who had killed both his wife and daughter, and he gave the police a detailed confession of how he had done so. When the case came to trial, though, Tim changed his story again and said Christie done it, but the jury did not believe him. He had made a detailed confession to murder, after all. He was found guilty, sentenced to death, and in March 1950, he was hanged. But now that Christie had been exposed as a serial killer, It seemed altogether possible that Tim Evans had been telling the truth when he said that Christie killed Beryl and Geraldine Evans. If so, the police and the courts had made very serious errors, and a terrible miscarriage of justice had taken place in Britain. Indeed, the Evans case became one of the crucial pieces of evidence in the overturning of the death penalty in the 1960s, when it was abolished for good. And the received wisdom about the story of what happened in 1949 is that Tim Evans was innocent and Reg Christie framed him. But when I was going through the records in the National Archives, I came across a document that suggested a different solution to the mystery of their murders. It was a memo by a prison guard which detailed a conversation that the guard had had with Reg Christie immediately after he was sentenced to death in 1953. I also found some letters in the Home Office records which showed how a government minister and the head of the civil service had plotted to conceal this prison guard's memo from public view, and indeed it was hidden for 40 years. The scenario outlined in this memo seemed to me the most plausible explanation for what really happened in Rillington Place that month. It seemed to explain why Tim Evans had both confessed to the murders of his wife and daughter and claimed that Christie done it. I called my book The Peepshow because Reg Christie was a voyeur. He liked to take pornographic photographs of women. He liked to spy on his neighbours and his fellow lodgers. And his fellow lodgers, and he liked to keep the bodies of his victims near him. But I also gave it this name because the Rillington Place murders seemed to create a nation of voyeurs, from the crowds outside the courts to the readers of the newspapers to the tabloid reporters hungry for more information, the tourists who tried to break into Rillington Place to see the crime scene. And I recognised that in telling this story at all, I was risking replaying Christie's Peepshow myself. I decided to shadow two writers who had investigated the case as it unfolded, a tabloid reporter called Harry Proctor and an eminent crime writer called Fryn Tennyson-Jesse. They were precursors of the true crime writers, podcasters, and documentary makers of today. There's been a huge surge in the popularity of true crime writing in the last 10 or 20 years, and especially among women. I hoped that this book might shed some light, for me at least, on why we are drawn to such stories.